The Midwest Central Railroad and Midwest Electric Railway and Midwest Old Threshers grounds is located in McMillan Park in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, and the address is 405 East Thresher Road in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. And also, Midwest Central Railroad started in 1960 with only 2 logging steam locomotives that were put in a railroad auction down in Georgia. Midwest Central Railroad's line is on the north end of McMillan Park. Also, the track of Midwest Central Railroad is 36-inch gauge and gives train rides mostly during events, which are sometimes 4th of July and Midwest Old Threshers Reunion, and that event is the largest thresher show in America and was started in 1950 and had taken place 5 days ending on Labor Day every year round. And Halloween events, Midwest Haunted Rails, along with the Great Pumpkin Train and North Pole Express. Midwest Central also has 2 station stops, which there is a North Station and a South Station. Also, Midwest Central Railroad has been giving people rides for many years, and the generation still continues as well. White Pass and Yukon 1131 was built, I believe, in the 1920s and is a narrow gauge flat car used on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad in Skagway, Alaska on freight trains. White Pass and Yukon 1131 hauled like crates that flat cars like this one hauled. This one hauled and other cargo may have hauled in the past. Also, White Pass and Yukon 1131 was then moved to be part of the Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, like the 1970s or 1980s, and is one of the numerous of flat cars on the Midwest Central Railroad today, and sometimes gets hauled around on the tracks or sometimes has parts set on top or other things as well. Kahului Railroad 12 was built by Baldwin in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1928 and is the 60,690th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 262 Prairie type steam locomotive and is a B3E class steam locomotive. Kahului Railroad 12 also has a tender that is known as a whaleback tender. Kahului Railroad 12 was once used in Hawaii for the Kahului Railroad on the Hawaiian island of Maui, Hawaii. Kahului Railroad 12 was given the nickname as Pineapple Princess, and also the last steam engine built for the Kahului Railroad. In the early 1970s, Kahului Railroad 12 was moved to the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad yards in Chama, New Mexico, and spent several years stored in pieces. Also, Kahului Railroad 12's reassembly time had came, and in 1988 was sold to the Silverwood Theme Park in Athol, Idaho. Kahului Railroad 12 was rebuilt with a new boiler constructed by Mammoth Locomotive Works of Grand Junction, Colorado. Kahului Railroad 12 was proved to be too big for Silverwood's track and was operated only sporadically at the park. The Colorado Historical Society purchased Kahului Railroad 12 from Silverwood Theme Park in Athol, Idaho in 2005 and moved it to the Georgetown Loop Railroad in Silver Plume, Colorado. Kahului Railroad 12 operated at the Loop in 2005 and 2006 and was returned to service in 2007 following a major overhaul during the off-season. Also, Kahului Railroad 12 has had a green boiler when being on Georgetown Loop and then changed to black. Also, Kahului Railroad 12 has operated on Georgetown Loop in Silver Plume, Colorado till 2012, and Midwest Central Railroad and Georgetown Loop each leased their steam locomotives to each other and other railroad. In 2011, the Georgetown Loop Railroad took possession of the Midwest Central Railroad Shay Westside Lumber Company 9, and in 2012, the Midwest Central Railroad took possession of the Kahului Railroad 12, and Kahului Railroad 12 has been operating in Mount Pleasant, Iowa at Midwest Central Railroad's tracks in McMillan Park and has been used for exciting most of the rail fans at Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, like it did on the Georgetown Loop Railroad in Silver Plume, Colorado, and is presently still operating on the Midwest Central Railroad where it is today. Denver and Rio Grande 3007, I believe, was built in the 1920s and is a wooden boxcar. Denver and Rio Grande 3007 was used on freight trains on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad in the past. Also, Denver and Rio Grande 3007 was then retired and then was privately owned, located northeast of Fort Collins, Colorado. The previous owner planned to convert this boxcar into a caboose, but luckily he didn't even get that far. Then got returned to former glory as Denver and Rio Grande 3007 and came to be part of Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa in 2013 and repainted and restored, and in its former glory look and can sometimes be seen rolling around as a freight train on Midwest Central Railroad, or on train sets when train rides are on Midwest Central Railroad are happening as well. Denver and Rio Grande 6216, I believe, was built in like the 1910s or 1920s or 1930s or later on. And it is a narrow gauge flat car Denver and Rio Grande 6216 was used on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad and hauled loads that a flat car like this one may have hauled in the past. Also, Denver and Rio Grande 6216 then later on came to be part of Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, like the 1970s or 1980s or later on, and is one of the numerous of flat cars on the Midwest Central Railroad today, and sometimes gets hauled around on the trackway, or sometimes has parts, stuff, and whatever set on top. And one time had a steam thresher right on top back in 2008, and probably before 2008 it had been being restored. Wood needed replacing, sides needed some touch-up work as well, and with the steam thresher riding on it, it may or may not happen again in the future, but I'm unsure if it might or might not happen again.
What you see right behind you, White Pass in Yukon.
White Pass in Yukon 1156 was built, I believe, in the 1920s. Also is a narrow gauge flat car used on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad in Skagway, Alaska, on freight trains. White Pass and Yukon 1156 hauled like crates that flat cars like this one hauled, and other cargo it may have hauled in the past. Also, White Pass and Yukon 1156 was then moved to be part of the Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, like the 1970s or 1980s, and is one of the numerous of flat cars on the Midwest Central Railroad today, and sometimes gets hauled around the Midwest on the Midwest Central Railroad tracks, or sometimes has parts and other stuff and like tracks set on top whenever it's not being used. Midwest Central Railroad 14 was built by the Plymouth Locomotive Works in Plymouth, Ohio in the 1960s and is a diesel hydraulic switcher. Midwest Central Railroad 14 has Cummins diesel power. Midwest Central Railroad 14 operated at a quarry in Ohio before coming to Iowa around 1990s. Originally, Midwest Central Railroad 14 operated on 38-inch gauge track when working at the quarry in Ohio, then was regauged to 36-inch gauge, 3 feet, at the Midwest Central Railroad shop in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, before entering service on the railroad. And today, Midwest Central Railroad 14 is also basically used for shunting and sometimes hauling the trains around McMillan Park in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, and still operates today. Also, Midwest Central Railroad 14's original railroad and past railroad before Midwest Central Railroad are unknown, but for now I have it listed as Midwest Central Railroad 14. White Pass in Yukon 903 was built, I believe, between 1950 and 1970 and is a steel caboose. White Pass in Yukon 903 was once used on the White Pass in Yukon Railroad, which is in Alaska. White Pass in Yukon 903 was originally painted in its original color, which it currently is then like somewhere between 1975 and 1980. White Pass in Yukon 903 was painted with for colors of stripes. Bottom color is blue, and going up, white, small orange stripe, and roof and cupola was painted black. White Pass and Yukon 903 was once used behind freight trains in the past when it was used in Alaska. White Pass and Yukon 903 is the only caboose that received the Federal Industries tricolor paint scheme. This color scheme is known as Flying Meatball or Bankrupt colors. As the White Pass and Yukon went into financial difficulties in the 1980s and had to close operation in late fall 1982, White Pass and Yukon 903 was then stored in North Vancouver and then was shipped to Mount Pleasant, Iowa around 1990. White Pass and Yukon 903 is one of 3 remaining White Pass and Yukon steel cabooses, and it is now has white letterings and been repainted to green and yellow stripes like it was before today. White Pass and Yukon 903 is mostly used for the winter event at Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, and when running, and can often be seen sitting in the yard, especially during Old Thresher's event. Also, White Pass and Yukon 903 is known to be the green caboose of Midwest Central Railroad as well.
What you see right behind you is Denver and Rio Grande 6206.
Denver and Rio Grande 6206, I believe, was built in the 1910s or 1920s or 1930s. And it is a narrow gauge flat car. Denver and Rio Grande 6206 was used on freight trains in the past for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad and hauled loads that a flat car like this one may have hauled in the past. Also, Denver and Rio Grande 6206 then later came to be part of Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, like the 1970s or 1980s or later on, and is one of the numerous of flat cars on the Midwest Central Railroad today. And sometimes gets hauled around the museum grounds on the Midwest Central line, or sometimes just has parts sitting on top, or other equipment, or like machine equipment, giant electric tools or such on top. And also, like before 2008, oh yeah, and one time had a front loader ride on the back on top in 2008, and it may or may not happen again in the future, but I'm unsure if it might or might not. And also, this flat car had been worked on and being restored before 2008, and wood needed replacing, and stenciling had to be done, and the Midwest Central Railroad workers had been working on the flat cars as well.
What you see right behind you is Denver and Rio Grande 3366.
Denver and Rio Grande 3366, I believe, was built in the 1920s and is a wooden boxcar. Denver and Rio Grande 3366 was used on freight trains on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad in the past, and also Denver and Rio Grande 3366 was then retired, then purchased from the Helfin collection, and also lived in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and I believe maybe in 2013, Denver and Rio Grande 3366 came to be part of Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, and sometimes can be seen part of train sets or just standing stationary whenever not being used. And Denver and Rio Grande 3366 can be seen part of Midwest Central Railroad where it is today.
What you see right behind me is White Pass and Yukon 1170.
White Pass in Yukon 1170 was built, I believe, in the 1920s and is a narrow gauge flat car used on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad in Skagway, Alaska on freight trains. White Pass and Yukon 1170 hauled like crates on that flat cars like this one hauled, and other cargo may have hauled in the past. Also, White Pass and Yukon 1170 was then moved to be part of Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, like the 1970s or 1980s, and is one of the numerous of flat cars on the Midwest Central Railroad today, and sometimes gets hauled or sometimes has parts or other stuff set on top of it.
I'm going to show you the Midwest Electric Railway and talk about it, so let's do.
Midwest Electric Railway is a non-profit educational organization and was founded in somewhere in the 1900s, and the goal at that time was to preserve historic electric-powered passenger trolleys that had operated in Iowa and transport passengers around the campgrounds during the Midwest Old Thrasher reunion. The original trolley stops were the trolley depot, the trolley barn, and Campers Gate. Also, Midwest Electric Railway even operates trolleys during some events as well. Trolley stop currently include the trolley depot, the trolley barn, the log village, Lakeview, South 40, and Campers Gate stations. Also, Midwest Electric Railway operates 3 trolleys from foreign countries, 2 from Brazil, 1 from Italy. Most of the trolleys you see on Midwest Electric Railway are trolleys that were built in America.
See right behind me is Rio de Janiero, 1779.
Rio de Janiero 1779 was built in 1911 in Rio de Janiero, Brazil, and is an open-air trolley. Rio de Janiero 1779 ran in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and has operated till 1967 and became part of a group of cars that came to the U.S. The design of these cars is called a Narragansett style, after a type developed by the Brill Car Company of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The interior woodwork is constructed of a Brazilian hardwood called Peroba de Camp. Rio de Janeiro 1779 joined the Old Threshers Collection and Midwest Electric Railway in the 1970s in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Also, Rio de Janeiro 1779 has also been operating on Midwest Electric Railway since then, and still does whenever Midwest Electric Railway trolleys are operating. Also, Rio de Janeiro 1779 was painted yellow a long time ago and then repainted to being green.
Right behind me is Waterloo, Cedar Falls, and Northern 381.
Waterloo, Cedar Falls, and Northern 381 was built in 1930 by Pearlie Thomas for Knoxville, Tennessee. Waterloo, Cedar Falls, and Northern 381 was used for hauling people around on trolley lines in the past. Then Waterloo, Cedar Falls, and Northern 381 was retired in 1958. Waterloo, Cedar Falls, and Northern 381 was the last streetcar to operate in Iowa. August 1st, 1958. It was preserved by the city of Waterloo and transferred to the Midwest Electric Railway in Mount Pleasant, Iowa in 1972. Waterloo, Cedar Falls, and Northern 381 has also been operating on Midwest Electric Railway since then and still does whenever Midwest Electric Railway trolleys are operating.
Right behind me is Milan, 1945.
Milan 1945 was built in 1927 in Milan, Italy, and is a Peter Witt type trolley car. Milan 1945 was used on trolley railways in Italy till 2002 and hauled people around the trolley line in Milan, Italy, and then was shipped to North America and was brought to the Midwest Electric Railway in Mount Pleasant, Iowa in 2002 and was the newest car added to the collection. Also, Milan 1945 has also been operating on Midwest Electric Railway since then and still does whenever Midwest Electric Railway trolleys are operating.
Right behind me is Rio de Janiero, 1779.
Rio de Janiero 1718 was built in 1911 in Rio de Janiero, Brazil, and is an open-air trolley. Rio de Janiero 1718 ran in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and has operated till 1967 and became part of a group of cars that came to the U.S. The design of these cars is called the Narragansett style, after a type developed by the Brill Car Company of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The interior woodwork is constructed of a Brazilian hardwood called Piroba de Camp. Rio de Janeiro 1718 joined the old Threshers collection in Midwest Electric Railway in the 1970s. Also, Rio de Janeiro 1718 has also been operating on Midwest Electric Railway since then, and still does whenever Midwest Electric Railway trolleys are operating.
Right behind you is Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin 320.
Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin 320 was built by the Jewett Car Company in Akron, Ohio in 1914 and is an interurban car. One of a group of wooden interurban cars built. This 52-passenger capacity car is 48 feet long, 8 feet wide, and capable of speeds in excess of 80 miles per hour. Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin 320 ran on streets in Chicago suburbs and operated between Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin, Illinois, from 1914 through 1961. It has been on display and in service at Old Threshers since 1968. Also, Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin 320 was then restored to operation and operates on Midwest Electric Railway in Mount Pleasant, Iowa today, and has also been operating on Midwest Electric Railway since then and still does whenever Midwest Electric Railway trolleys are operating.
Right behind you is Westside Lumber Company, Lelvin.
Westside Lumber Company, Lelvin was built in 1930 and is a Model A Ford Fireman truck. Westside Lumber Company, Lelvin was also used on the Westside Lumber Company whenever it was inspecting tracks mostly, and was used for hauling crews on board. Also, Westside Lumber Company, Lelvin then came to be part of Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa in 1966 when the Shay was purchased, and can be often seen running and trailing behind trains along with the Model T. Along with the Model T, they are known as the toys on the rails, but are still running and even often given visitors rides or just trailing behind the trains.
Right behind you is Argent Lumber Company, 25.
Argent Lumber Company 25 was built in 1923 and is a Model T Ford Foreman's truck. Argent Lumber Company 25 was originally a vehicle used to run on roads and was then converted to being on narrow gauge tracks and as an inspection vehicle. Argent Lumber Company 25 also was used for inspecting tracks on the Argent Lumber Company and was used for hauling crews on board. Also, Argent Lumber Company 25 then came to be part of Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa in 1960 when the two steam locomotives were purchased and can often be seen running and trailing behind trains, and along with the Model A, they are known as the railroad's toys on the rails, but are still running and even often giving visitors rides or just trailing behind trains as well. Georgetown, Breckenridge, and Leadville 5713 was built as a cattle car, and I believe this car was built somewhere in the 1920s or 1930s. Also, Georgetown, Breckenridge, and Leadville 5713 was originally known as Denver and Rio Grande 5713, and then railroad name was then given as Georgetown, Breckenridge, and Leadville 5713, and this car once hauled cattle from farms to whatever destination in the past on the Denver and Rio Grande and Georgetown, Breckenridge, and Leadville railroads. Also, Georgetown, Breckenridge, and Leadville 5713 was also used at places in Colorado, and I think it was used at the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, Colorado first. Then the Georgetown Loop Railroad in Silver Plume, Colorado, and might have gone somewhere else after Georgetown Loop. Then in summer 2015, Georgetown, Breckenridge, and Leadville 5713 came to be part of Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, and is also used as on the train sets whenever trains are operating, and it may mostly be used when the weather is warm. Denver and Rio Grande 705 was built between somewhere I think maybe in the 1880s and 1890s and 1920s and 1930s, somewhere between one of those years, and is a gondola car. Denver and Rio Grande 705 was used on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, hauling whatever gondolas hauled like coal or anything it hauled before, and also Denver and Rio Grande 705 was later converted as a riding car and used on the Georgetown Loop Railroad in Silver Plume, Colorado for giving rides. Then in summer 2015, Denver and Rio Grande 705 then came to be part of Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, where it is today, and can be seen part of train sets whenever the trains of Midwest Central Railroad are operating. Denver and Rio Grande 203 is like a replica baggage passenger coach and is one of the coaches on Midwest Central Railroad constructed from a freight car from various railroads, including the Southern Pacific, East Broadtop, and Westside Lumber Company, and constructed at the Midwest Central Railroad shop using Southern Pacific flat cars as a foundation. Also, Denver and Rio Grande 203 is often used as one of the coaches used on train sets on Midwest Central Railroad whenever the Midwest Central Railroad has trains operating in McMillan Park in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 55 was built by Ohio Falls Car Company in Clarksville, Indiana, around 1880, and it served on the Bellevue and Cascade originally in northeast Iowa until the line closed around 1936. It was the railroad's only caboose. After the Bellevue and Cascade shut down, one of its engineers bought the caboose and kept it on the property as storage. It sat outside rotting away for decades before moved to Mequeoketa in the 60s. By this time, its condition was very bad around 1980. Around 1980, Jim Schroeder purchased what was left of the car and got to work on what became a very impressive restoration. He meticulously replaced all the rotten wood, creating an exact copy of each piece. He reused what hardware could be. He could, but nearly all the wood is new. When finished, he used the car as sort of a guest house. In 2004, Midwest Central Railroad volunteer Phil Boris contacted the Schroeder family some time ago and got the ball rolling on this project. Mrs. Schroeder was moving and the family needed to find a home for the caboose. Right after the 2004 Old Thresher reunion, Matt Kroll and Jesse Van Winkle drove to Bellevue to talk to the family and look at the caboose over. The family felt the Midwest Central Railroad would provide a good home for the car, and plans were started to transporting it. This would be the hard part. Hiring an outfit to truck it would be very expensive because the size and location it's at in up a steep driveway with trees around it. After much brainstorming, Matt Kroll came up with a combine head trailer that they could rent and that Midwest Central Railroad could rent. It was nearly the right length with the wheels at the body bolster of the car, and it sat low enough that height would not be a problem. Mounts that bolted to the trailer were fabricated. As soon as the 2004 Ghost Train was over, in 2004, some of the volunteers headed to Bellevue and loaded up the car. Mark Kroll provided the truck to pull the trailer and all the tools required to fasten the caboose in place. The caboose was jacked up. Then trucks rolled out and was loaded. They took it slow and everything went well and pulled it into Mount Pleasant Sunday afternoon. The move was a big success. It had been on the rails now for over a decade. Occasional maintenance to the Caboose running gear body and frame has kept this beauty in running condition. It sees service at nearly every operating event at Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, and used behind train sets whenever Midwest Central Railroad has the trains operating. Also, Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 55 is the red caboose on Midwest Central Railroad as well. Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 was built by Baldwin in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1891 and is the 12,288th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 260 mogul type steam locomotive. Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 was once a logging locomotive in forests for the Surry, Sussex, and Southampton Railway in Virginia. Then in the 1920s, Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 was then used for the Argent Lumber Company in South Carolina and was known as Argent Lumber Company 6. Then went back to being Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6. Then later on, Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 was then retired, then put for sale at a railroad auction in Georgia. Then Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 was one of the first 2 steam locomotives bought by the Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa in 1960. Then moved to McMillan Park in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, and is the first steam locomotive to operate on the Midwest Central Railroad, and was the main rod engine until 1971, when it was taken out of service in 1988. When it was taken out of service, and in 1988 it came out of one of the most in-depth rebuilds in the country. Also, Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 is named Maria as well. Also, Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 was then used operating on the Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, and hauling visitors around as one of the steam engines of Midwest Central Railroad. Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 was originally built to burn wood, and it still burnt wood when it came to live in Mount Pleasant. Then later was converted to burn oil. Then in 2008, Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 went out of service for an overhaul just a couple years, and then in 2010, Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 operated on Midwest Central tracks once again after 2 years of absence. A 2-year absence. Also, Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 appeared in the 2010 movie Dogjack. In the movie location, one of the movie locations was at McMillan Park in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Also, today, Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 is like the only remaining Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 260 today, and can be seen operating on Midwest Central Railroad tracks during operations of Midwest Central Railroad as well. Also, Surry, Sussex, and Southampton 6 is also known to be the oldest operating steam locomotive in the state of Iowa as well. Midwest Central Railroad 200 was constructed in Midwest Central Railroad shops from freight cars from various railroads from either Southern Pacific, East Broadtop, or Westside Lumber Company. Also, Midwest Central Railroad 200 is also named Mignon and was built from scratch on one of the 4x30 wood frame truss rods flat cars brought from the Southern Pacific's abandoned Keller branch in 1961. It was designed by partially copying an 1865 coach model. The Mignon was rebuilt in later years when the coach needed some remodeling. Also today, Midwest Central Railroad 200 is used on train sets on Midwest Central Railroad whenever trains are running, and carries visitors on board whenever the Midwest Central Railroad has the trains running as well.
What you see right behind me is the Midwest Central Railroad Caboose.
The Midwest Central Railroad Caboose is the first caboose for Midwest Central Railroad that grew from plans of a Florence and Cripple Creek caboose in April 1959 issue of Railroad Model Craftsman. Its builders noted it was most likely the first time a replica caboose was built in reverse from model plans with its windowed cupola. It quickly became the most popular car for riders. Also, the Midwest Central Railroad caboose is also used on train sets on the back, mostly on the Midwest Central Railroad in Mount Pleasant, Iowa at McMillan Park, giving people rides whenever the trains are running, and is the yellow caboose on the Midwest Central Railroad as well. Midwest Central Railroad 303 is one of the coaches on Midwest Central Railroad, constructed from a freight car from various railroads, including the Southern Pacific, East Broadtop, and the Westside Lumber Company, and constructed at the Midwest Central Railroad shops using Southern Pacific flat cars as a foundation. Also, Midwest Central Railroad 301 is often used as one of the identical yellow coaches on the train sets on Midwest Central Railroad whenever the Midwest Central Railroad has trains running in McMillan Park in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Midwest Central Railroad 302 is one of the coaches on Midwest Central Railroad, constructed from freight cars from various railroads, including the Southern Pacific, East Broadtop, and Westside Lumber Company, and constructed at the Midwest Central Railroad shops using Southern Pacific flat cars as a foundation. Also, Midwest Central Railroad 302 is often used as one of the identical yellow coaches used on train sets on Midwest Central Railroad whenever the Midwest Central Railroad has trains running in McMillan Park in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Midwest Central Railroad 202 is one of the coaches on Midwest Central Railroad, constructed from a freight car from various railroads, including the Southern Pacific, East Broadtop, and Westside Lumber Company, and constructed at the Midwest Central Railroad shops using Southern Pacific flat cars as a foundation. Also, Midwest Central Railroad 202 is often used as one of the identical yellow coaches used on train sets on Midwest Central Railroad whenever the Midwest Central Railroad has trains running in McMillan Park in Mount Pleasant, Iowa.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed learning about trains with me today on the Matthew Last Train Guy segment show. Also, I hope to see you all again in the next segment show. This is Matthew Last, host of Matthew Last Train Guy segment show, signing out. Until next time, all aboard!